Hi, welcome to the 5 principles of the Anxiety Coach community. The first one is you don't need to have anxiety. Anxiety is not necessary for your life. Now, if you've lived with anxiety for a long time, you might say, well, that's easy for you to say. I'm not saying that anxiety is necessarily easy to get rid of. I'm saying it's not necessary. You don't have to have anxiety. Now, I say that because I myself, I've worked with hundreds, over 800 people who have had anxiety, and the vast majority of those got to a point where they have no anxiety. So they went from anxious to not anxious because they went through a process of cognitive behavioral coaching or cognitive behavioral therapy, and so they learned how not to be anxious. So really, anxiety for the most part is not knowing how not to be anxious. And if you know how not to be anxious, then you don't need to be anxious. So millions of people every year go through what we might call treatment strategies, right? And they become non-anxious. So that tells you it's not necessary. There's no pills involved necessary for many people. There's no hands-on, there's no nothing. There's learning how not to be anxious. So that's the first principle of Anxiety Coach. You don't need to be anxious because many people learn not to be anxious. And you could be one of those. The second principle of Anxiety Coach is that anxiety is a mistake made by your brain. Now the reason I say that is because the emotion behind anxiety is fear. And fear can't be ignored. It's a very powerful emotion. It's a very useful emotion because fear kept your ancestors alive, however long ago, right? Millions of years ago. So millions of years ago, if one of your ancestors felt fear, they had to pay attention because the cost of looking at something that's, attending to fear and there's nothing there, there's no cost. But if you fail to address fear and there is something there that would eat you, then you're done. Okay? So you're programmed to pay attention to fear. But millions of years ago, your ancestors did not have language and they did not have imagination. They were basically just clever animals, hunting and gathering and doing what other animals did. But then at some point in our evolution, maybe 150,000, 200,000 years ago, we started to develop language and imagination. And then 50,000, 60,000 years ago, we started to develop a culture and a civilization that is culminating in where we are now because we have imagination and we have language. But if you think about this, our physiology hasn't changed. So we still have exactly the same fight or flight system that we had a million years ago. But if you think about this like this, we have no external threat. You do not have tigers and lions. You do not have dinosaurs or whatever. You have no external threat. The only threat you have is internally generated. But your fight or flight system responds as if there's a tiger going to eat you. Your fight or flight system responds as if it's threatening, that there's something threatening your life, but there isn't. You can imagine something threatening your life, but that's not threatening your life. But you get exactly the same fear response, exactly the same physiology, you get exactly the same kind of urge to fight or flee, which incidentally is what creates panic, right? You have the massive coursing of adrenaline through your system and cortisol, the stress hormone, but there's nothing you need to do because you're not unsafe. So panic is a prime example of your brain making a mistake. You don't have a threat, but you're desperate to fight for your life, to flee, but you don't have a threat. Anxiety is the feeling of fear without a threat. That's why it's a mistake. And that's why, well, not that's why, but that tells you that it's possible to retrain your brain to stop making this mistake. Because that's what happens when people go through treatment strategies. The brain stops making the mistake. But if you continue to accept the mistake as legit, right? Yeah, I need to be anxious because, whatever, then nothing will change. So, anxiety is a mistake made by your brain. Recognize that, embrace the idea, and go about changing that mistake. The third principle is that anxiety wants you to do things which are not helpful. It either wants you to do things which are not helpful, or it prevents you from doing things which are helpful. Anxiety is not a passive passenger in your life. Anxiety is active. I can't go there because. I can't do that because. Oh, I couldn't do that because. Oh, I wouldn't do that because you never know what might happen. Well, I can't do that. Ah, I can't. I just wouldn't feel right. Anxiety tells you not to do stuff. Anxiety tells you to do other stuff. Oh, I better stay in. I better not push myself out. I better not do a public talk or presentation. I better not ask for more money. I better not go for a promotion. I better not take more responsibility. I better not start my own business, right? Anxiety makes you do things that are not helpful, and it stops you doing things that create growth and progress in your life. So what do you do? Well, what do you do that anxiety makes you do? And is it helpful to you? So pay attention, because once we start recognizing what anxiety makes you do or stops you from doing, now we have things that we can practice changing. Many of the internal programs that we run that create the problems that we have are habitual. And we always have to have an alternative to a habit if we want to break the habit. So if you're going to give up smoking, although people don't smoke much these days, but I use the example. If you want to give up smoking, it's really good to have an alternative. And an alternative is not a vape. An alternative might be an orange or a mint, or it might be do something with your hands. An alternative is an alternative to the problem. If you don't have an alternative to the problem, you have to have the problem. So we always want to be creating alternatives before we need them. It's too late to create an alternative when you need it. If you crave something, that craving, as it increases, captures your attention. If you haven't got an alternative already worked out, it's lost. Okay? So we always have to have an alternative, and we're always practicing the alternative, because that way we're always progressing. In life, we can do things which are helpful and we can do things which are not helpful. And correct practice defeats anxiety. And correct practice defeats anxiety because it opens up your comfort zone. Because anxiety wants your comfort zone to be smaller. Because if you think about it, anxiety is the expression of fear. And the only way you can be sure of being safe is to shrink your comfort zone down so small that basically you can't move. And I've known people whose comfort zone was the closet. Many people's comfort zone was the bedroom, the house, the town, the street. Many people's comfort zone is much smaller than it needs to be. But correct practice pushes the comfort zone. So we're always proactively practicing what's useful and actively not practicing what's not useful. If we follow these 5 principles, we're well on the way to retraining your brain to stop giving you anxiety as a habit, as a matter of course. And it frees you. It frees you to have more of what you want in your life. It frees you to be more yourself. Being free of anxiety is like being free of a brake on your life. And I'd liken it to, anxiety is like wearing heavy lead diver's boots. You can do stuff, but it's a lot of effort, which is why it's very tiring to be anxious and why it takes so long and why it's so difficult. Free yourself of these boots. Free yourself of the brake of anxiety. And have fun being who you could be. And until you really try it, you don't know what you can achieve. And I think that's a brilliant way to live your life. So, I hope you find this interesting, the principles of Anxiety Coach. And I look forward to accompanying you on your journey.